Good morning, everyone. I am going to speak to you this morning about how to write a historical essay. This is really important in the sense that sometimes most students, especially if they come to community college, are not prepared to write history essays. This is largely a product of, I would say, a missed opportunity in high school to nail down some principles that are fairly easy once you get a hang of them, but they can sound sort of complex. So what I'm going to do today is break down in its easiest form so you can really sort of get yourself up to speed in terms of if you didn't get it in high school, well, you can work on it here. And then the more you keep writing, if you take other social science courses, humanities or English, for example, then you'll do a lot of writing. So this is what I'm going to do today, and I'll try to do it in about 25 minutes or less. Probably won't get there, but I'll basically try to do that. Okay, the first couple of things that you need to know about writing is that no matter what kind of writing it is, whether it's fiction, history, writing, memos at work, no matter what, they follow the same basic techniques. Also, writing is essentially very difficult no matter what you do on any level. Just the art of learning how to move a pen or how to use a computer to be able to type, or a typewriter if you still have one of those old things. And that's essentially where I learned to type on a typewriter, not a computer. Um, Whether you are just writing memos, what have you, you have to write all the time in order to get better at writing. Ernest Hemingway, all the other writers struggled at writing all of their lives because it is essentially a lonely and it is a very self-exposing activity. When you write memos at work or you write a letter to your professor to slip in his inbox or what have you, what you put on paper is a facsimile of yourself. It is an expression of who you are as a person. Me, sometimes I rush through things and I may have typos in my writing because I'm rushing. I think really fast and I type really fast. I type about 80 words per minute. And sometimes my brain and my fingers are not in sync. And even when I go back over it, I'll miss typos. But this is a byproduct of me being a person who's somewhat impatient. So I know that about myself, so I have to have extra care in my writing. So it's just what I'm getting at. It's a very difficult activity that everybody struggles with. So if you're struggling in writing in this course or in other courses, welcome to the world of writing. Now, the paper that I wanted you to read and had you take the exam in is How to Write a Historical Essay in the Social Sciences. Writing is essentially the same, whether it's in English or in social sciences, but there are several nuances for each one. The best way that I can explain it to you is for people who play sports. Yeah, you all play basketball, but each team has their own plays and their own nuances. And when you move from team to team, you've got to learn those new plays and those nuances and get used to new people and new ways of doing things. So writing in English is different than writing in social science, which is different than writing in pure science. All of these fields, whether it's biology, chemistry, you need to learn how to write because you need to be able to write grants. You need to be able to write papers demonstrating that you have discovered something so other people can read it. All of these things have their own nuances, and in those professions, they will teach you. But as you move through college, you need to know the difference between the different kinds of writing. So what I'm prepared to do is to give you just a general overview of writing the historical essay. Now, there are some basic elements that you need. The three essential elements that you need are a thesis, body of evidence, and a conclusion. Those are the basic elements of writing. And you should ask yourself before you turn any paper in, does your paper have a thesis, a body of evidence, and a conclusion? If you conclude that you do not have those three elements, then you don't have a valid paper, and you need to put those in your paper before you turn it in. Now, the thesis and evidence are divided into essentially three parts. Basically, an introduction, the development of an idea, and its conclusion. Let me repeat that. The thesis and evidence are divided into three parts. First, you're going to introduce the subject, then you're going to introduce your argument, and then you're going to conclude, and that's essentially it. So all scholarly writing, for the most part, follows those three basic elements. It usually takes me with college writing about a paragraph to figure out whether or not you're going to have these essential elements. So typically what you're going to do in the first couple of sentences, maybe if you really get good at it, in the first sentence, tell me what the paper is about. Just give me the who, what, when, and where, essentially. Then the next thing that you're going to do is present your thesis statement. If you want to be extra sort of prudent and you want to make sure that your faculty member, your professor, or your audience who's reading your paper or what have you, or your book, gets your thesis statement, you could literally say in your paper, my argument is the following. My argument is this. I assert that. I argue that. I present this. It is my thesis that. It is my argument that. That automatically, those words automatically show the individual who's reading it what your thesis statement is. Some writers put their thesis statement in a way that it clearly is their thesis statement, but they don't have the words I argue. They'll simply do something like say, and this is just an example, 300 out of 400 basketball players cannot dunk a basketball. That is an argument. They don't say, my argument is 300 or 400 players cannot dunk a basketball. They just say 300 or 400 players cannot dunk a basketball. And then after that, they'll say something like, I will present evidence that will back up my thesis, or they say something, the following evidence suggests, or they just begin to start laying out their evidence. So typically, if it takes me a few paragraphs to figure out what's going on, I just get the general sense that you haven't thought of a thesis statement, and then I just basically go through your paper very quickly looking at grammar, and then I just give you a low grade because you haven't done the thesis statement. So part of being in college is really learning how to nail down that thesis statement. What is it that you're going to be conveying? What is the purpose of me reading your paper? That is the thesis statement. You're coming to me arguing a certain point. You're coming to me proving a certain point. The reason why we have you write it down is because writing was developed 80,000 years ago, essentially, some basic forms of writing, and essentially 6,000 years ago. But essentially, my point is that it was meant and created to convey ideas to the next person that you could not tell them verbally. So maybe it was a person who lived in the next town. Maybe it was a person who would come years after you died. You wanted to convey information to them. Writing, it was a medium of conveying that information. The thesis is a method by which you can tell the person immediately what is the point of this paper. So you must do that. You must learn quickly in your papers to present what the point of your paper is. What is your argument? Because if you didn't have a point, if you didn't have an argument, what's the point of writing the paper? You don't have anything to say. But since you want to get a college degree and you want to learn how to convey ideas that you have, then that's what writing is for. If you don't have any ideas, if you're not interested in creating any ideas, you probably should drop out of college and just get a job, because that's what we do here in college. We learn how to think big. We learn how to become leaders. You get a college education, you can become a general in the Army just with a bachelor's degree. So my point is that this is a medium. Now let's talk about the thesis. The thesis itself, as we stated, was the argument. The point now, there are many students who fall into the trap of just repeating the overall question that's given to you. I'm asking students to decipher between, let's say, take one of Jared Diamond's arguments on germs. And I say, well, for the task at hand is to identify one of the arguments of Jared Diamond. You don't write in your paper as your thesis, I'm going to argue one of the points or arguments of Jared Diamond. That's just restating my question. That's rather obvious. What I'm trying to get you to do in that thesis statement is to demonstrate originality and critical thinking. So you need to take that question and to think about it. The thesis itself is beyond just mere opinion. It is a point of view, it is a perspective somewhat of sorts, and you can see that in my paragraph on that. It is an opinion, it is a perspective, but it has to be an informed perspective, an informed opinion. So how do you personally know that 300 basketball players can't dunk a basketball? How do you know that? You either observed it, you either interviewed 300 basketball players and asked them and had them demonstrate that they cannot dunk a basketball, or you read books that stated that. If that's the case, then that is the evidence that you have to formulate an argument. But that's an informed argument, an informed thesis. You just can't make a thesis up out of thin air. So what I'm trying to get you to do is to start thinking about how to take a question or what you need to write about and to think about how to formulate an argument. So most of the time, how people formulate arguments is that they're passionate about something and they want to make a point or prove a point. Sometimes you may not be as passionate about an argument. So for example, you might not be passionate about the meeting of the first founders and the discovery of America, but you need to find something to be passionate about and to argue something. I'll give an example. For myself, when I first started being introduced to the conquistador domination of the Aztecs, I could not believe that 100, 200, 800 conquistadors were able to overthrow a million or so Aztecs. I just could not believe that. So my arguments were always is that I didn't necessarily have as much evidence, but I could not believe logistically 800 people could defeat an army of a million. And I laid out the reasons why that was. One, mass force, the logistics of carrying that many bullets and guns and all those kinds of things. It was impossible. So that's what I wrote in my thesis, that logistically, from a military standpoint, that this was impossible for them to do, and that there's more to be learned before we can just say that 800 conquistadors were able to defeat a million Aztecs. Later on, or I presented that paper, I got an A on the paper. I didn't have all the evidence, it was just hypothesis, and I used evidence of military strategy outside of the Aztec situation to support my thesis. Years later, Jared Diamond wrote a book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, right, that supported this, right? And other writers, you've read Listening to the Indians and the Conquest of Mexico, and there is doubt that the conquistadors were able to do that. Right? What we now know of is that the Aztecs fought back, but they were probably succumbed to disease and they were powerless. So that's how you formulate ideas. That's just one strategy, but this is something, if you don't know how to do it, you'll have to work on for later. Right? So reread my section on thesis. Google what a thesis is. If you have any questions, re-ask. Now, in order for, again, let me re-stress this point. In order for you to make that thesis, you need to have good evidence. The evidence that you provide to prove to me that those 300 or 400 people cannot dunk a basketball has to come from somewhere. Like I said, interviews, or you saw it and witnessed it firsthand, but that is evidence. So how you provide that evidence is up to you, or how you gather it. For our purposes, we're mostly going to be reading other texts, and then you're going to be using your intuition. Now, to support your argument, you're going to have to use some type of system to let me know what your evidence is. So typically what we do is we use things like footnotes or endnotes, parenthetical citations, if you're familiar with those, right? So these footnotes or endnotes or parenthetical citations um, are an helpful aid, because if your faculty member or your professor doesn't necessarily believe in your thesis, then you have all the supporting evidence. And my duty then is to not to sit there and say that you're wrong about your thesis, but to look at your evidence and your thesis to see if they work well. And I give you grades not based on whether or not your thesis is correct, but whether or not you have the evidence to support it. So if you write a paper that says something like, the United States lost World War II, and you provide me evidence for that, I'm going to say you're pretty crazy, because there's no evidence that you're going to find that's going to say that the United States did win World War II. So it's got to be a credible thesis and credible supporting evidence. But if you tell me that men never landed on the moon, and you have credible evidence for that, because I've never been to the moon, right? We have eyewitnesses who saw that we won World War II. We have few eyewitnesses except for the TV shot that they were showing us. But if you have evidence for that, then I can't say that you're wrong. I look at the evidence and gauge the evidence itself, not whether or not your thesis is quote unquote correct. Okay? So the primary way, again, to remember is that you've got to provide sources for your argument, and you use those in footnotes or endnotes, and your footnotes and endnotes and your citations must be correct. If you provide me with bogus citations that don't work, then your evidence is probably no good. So I'm going to downgrade you because your citations aren't credible. So if you don't know how to do citations, then you need to learn how, and you need to learn how quickly. I've provided you with a website, the OWL at Purdue University. I've sent that to you. You should be on that all day learning. If you have any questions about that, you should get back to me. Now, let's take a look at historical writing in its essence. It's not the same as writing in other fields, as I expressed before. What we do, historians do, is we write papers or books on evidence of the past. Historians are not interested in the future and not really interested in the present. The past helps inform the present and the future, and we historians sit back and we see those things in the past, and we kind of are able to anticipate what might happen based on other events, but we do not write about the future or the present. We're concerned with the past. Okay, sociologists, political scientists, other groups write about the present and the future, but historians primarily do not. Okay, so the historical evidence that you're going to provide for me is going to be that evidence that will illuminate something that happened in the past, not the present. Historians are not futurists, right? So there is no what ifs. So what you're going to be doing is making a point of using names, places, and dates. So therefore, that when you're writing, you're going to tell me the who, what, when, and where, because that's all about names, places, and dates, and it gives me a context about when this happened in the past, right? We historians do not dwell on essentially what if something happened or did not. That's just not in our purview. We're trying to illuminate for our readers why we believe certain persons, actors in the past, did certain things, not whether or not if they would have done that, then things might have turned out better. No, that's for a person who is a sociologist, political scientist, etc. Now, what steps should you take in writing this essay? Obviously, you need to read all the material and then read it again until you're firmly familiar with what the thesis is of the material that you're reading. Then what you need to do is understand the question that I'm asking or the assignment. I'm going to typically provide you with a question. When you guys go off to graduate school, there won't be any questions. You'll read a book and they'll say, write a paper about the book. And then you've got to decide what you're going to write about. Particularly here, I'm going to give you a question. Now, for your sources, once you've done the readings, right, you've got, you get the essential question and you've done the basic readings, you've got to go out and do your own scholarly research. This is what we do in college. If you don't like doing research, then probably you could probably get away with being in college a little bit, but it's going to be awfully difficult. Or especially if you're going to a really good university, not a Cal State LA or a Cal State Dominguez or Northridge, but if you're going to a really good one like UCLA, Berkeley, those universities, Irvine, Santa Cruz, top universities, then you're going to do research. And even some of the better Cal States like Cal State San Francisco, San Jose State, Humboldt, those places, you're going to have to do research. So if research is not your thing, probably you need to get a job. Probably not in a good spot. For my classes, you're not allowed to use things like Wikipedia or other websites. The only sites that you can use are the LA City College library website, and the only database that you can use in that and their database is JSTOR. JSTOR is essentially a company, and it's JSTOR, and I've forgotten what it stands for. But JSTOR is essentially a company that has collected all the scholarly articles that are written by professors, and they've been collecting these since the 1800s, or they've gone back and gotten all of them since the 1800s. And they put them in a database, so any topic that you can actually ever think of that professors, scholarly folks like myself have taken a look at and wrote about, you'll find them in JSTOR. So, but that's standard. You're going to be using JSTOR at better colleges, so I want you to get used to using them here. So when you transfer, you'll automatically know what JSTOR is, and nobody has to tell you what it is, right? So if you use Wikipedia, I'm going to just give you an F for the paper. I'll know that you use Wikipedia. Look, there are no topics in U.S. history that you know of that I don't. So anything that you write about, I'm going to know the topic and I'm going to know where you got the information from. So the quickest way to get an F in my class is to use anything but JSTOR and scholarly books. And if you try to present a book that I know is not scholarly, then you're going to get an F. So what's a scholarly book? Typically, a scholarly book is one that you will find in a college library. If you're not near a college library, then it's in the adult section of your home library, your city library. And you can generally get a feel of a scholarly book because essentially it's not written to a fifth grade audience, and you can pretty much tell that. The rule of thumb is that you should use more sources than one or two. The tendency is that you'll just try to grab one source off JSTOR. It's not going to work. You probably need more sources. And the reason why you need more sources is because if you just try to present me with one source, we call that a straw man. In order to make an argument sound and solid, you have to kind of provide enough scholarly evidence to make the person say, okay, you made your point. You've shown to me that there's just more than one person or thing saying that there's a good body of evidence to suggest that your point is correct. Okay? Now, don't rush through your assignments. Obviously, try to take your time. I know everybody's stressed for time, but that means that you just have to burn the midnight oil. Being in college means burning midnight oil, staying up late, right? It's 5:45. I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday when I could be watching TV, laying in bed, doing whatever, just relaxing, chilling. I'm doing this for you guys. So you have to burn midnight oil. Okay, the first draft. You write your first draft. Now, typically how you get to your first draft is up to you. Some people like to write outlines, and if you're not really good at it, or you've never written an outline, Google writing an outline and they'll explain to you how to do that. If you already know how to write an outline is a good guide because it keeps you on point. Sometimes I use outlines, typically when I'm writing very technically oriented pieces, because it helps to keep my flows in sequence. When I don't use outlines is when I'm trying to write more artly papers that are for a non-scholarly audience, and I want it, the papers are best written for me in free form. And what I mean by that is I just sit in front of the computer and just start typing. Whatever comes off the top of my head about that idea, I just get it on paper, no matter what it is, no matter how silly I think it is. Even if I say, I'm right in the middle of typing a good argument and I lose my train of thought and I get in Mary had a little lamb, I type in Mary had a little lamb. Just keep the paper, your fingers moving, and just keep the ideas. Then you come out with some, 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then you look at it and then I delete. I just say, okay, that's just ridiculous, and then I take stuff out. The first draft should not be your only draft. You should at least write minimum 2 drafts of your paper. Minimum. I know you're rushed for time. The better paper, sometimes you can get in 3 drafts. But the draft itself, you should be working out and rereading your draft to make sure that your sentences flow well, that you're eliminating errors, that you need to refine your grammar. One of the things that students do all the time is that they use words that they're either too big, which is not good. Don't try to impress me with your flowery language, right? I already know, I'm sorry. I already know big words, so to speak, but you don't need to try to impress me with big words or flowery sentences. Just use plain language. Impress me with your body of evidence. Put it that way. Also, in your drafts, be prepared that if don't like a sentence so much that you know that it doesn't really fit, take it out. Students do that all the time. They say, well, I knew that didn't work, but I didn't want to take it out. And they get wedded to it. The one thing that you have to understand about writing, don't wed yourself to your own words. Sometimes you'll write a sentence and you say, wow, that sentence came out really nice, but it doesn't fit, and you don't want to take it out. Take it out. Think of your papers not as your babies, but works in progress. Always works in progress. That's why you see these textbooks with 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th editions. Faculty members see what they've written, say, I need to change that. Okay? So when you're writing, pay attention to the following points. Make sure that you organize your ideas on paper. Make sure you organize, and an outline will help you to do that. Good organization helps. I organize a lot of the things in my head, right? So that's when I freeform. Be attentive to paragraphs and construction of those paragraphs. If you have a whole page that's a paragraph, that ain't a paragraph. If you have a 1 sentence that's a paragraph, it better be a majestic sentence that it can stand on its own. Most paragraphs can't. Most paragraphs are more than 1 sentence. So if you see a standalone sentence, that ain't a paragraph. Let's see. Each paragraph should be a supporting of your thesis. There should be no paragraphs in your paper that don't support your thesis statement. Pay attention to transition sentences. So when you move from paragraph to paragraph, you're transitioning with those last sentences smoothly. Take time with your conclusion. You need to sum up everything that you've written in your paper, in your conclusion. I proved this. I argued that this was the way, and I believe that I have shown that. Right? That's a conclusion. Try to do drafts. One of the things that I like to do is when I write my paper, I always read my paper back to myself. And when I read it, I hear myself reading the paper and I can tell all the errors and the sentences that don't work. Okay? That's one strategy. So when you get done writing your paper, make sure that you proof it. Reread it to find all the grammar errors, the things that don't make sense. Get a friend to do that. Get your parents, if you live with your family, get your parents to read your papers. Get a friend, somebody, a stranger. You're on the bus. Get somebody to read it. Grading. Now, every instructor, especially those with PhDs, have their own standards for excellent, good, average, and acceptable work. And what I always run it up against is this. Students come in from Marshall High School or what have you, and they said, look, I had a 3.5 grade point average, and I got a D on my paper, and I never got a D before. First of all, if you had a 3.5 for Marshall High School, you should be at UCLA, and you shouldn't be at LA City College, so I have my doubts. But let's say that you decided to come to LA City College for whatever reason. Marshall High School essentially is run by some good people, but their standards are not our standards. And even the college's standards are not my standard. I hold my students to the same standards that you would held to if you were at UCLA or Berkeley. And the reason why I do that is because my classes are all transfer classes. I don't teach classes that you cannot transfer to Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Cornell, Riverside, Irvine, San Diego. All of my classes transfer to every university in this country. Therefore, those professors are expecting that you will be able to write at a college level. So I give you the grade based upon college level work, and that, I think, is your expectation. So if you get A's on my paper, you're probably writing at UC level. If you get C's, D's, F's in my paper, you're probably writing at a high school or a Cal State level. And that's not good. All right, so you should know, I've put the notes on grading on here, so you should have some idea of that. Originality and plagiarism. Nobody is born into this world already knowing everything. Everything that a professor knows or Einstein or Newton knew came from reading other people and thinking about things and taking other ideas and making them their own and twisting their ideas. I have all of the basis by which most of my understanding of the world is put together is by reading Marxist historians and people like Karl Marx and individuals like Ernest Becker, who were psychologists, Otto Rank, Carl Jung. These are the people that informs my understanding, and I take what they've done and I extrapolate it. But I give these people credit for that. My citations in my work point back to these people that I'm borrowing their ideas from to make fresh ideas. It is okay to take a song, to retwist it, to make it fresh. It is okay to take an idea, to look at it, to reconfigure it, to retwist it, to make it fresh. It's okay to do that. Most rock music, the Doors, the Beatles, all those people in the 60s, 70s, they borrowed from black blues musicians and took their music and twisted it. Now, a lot of them didn't give these people credit, and so that's what we bashed them for. People like Eric Clapton, is that you took the music and you gave nobody credit for it. Well, we scholars, when we write text and we borrow people's ideas to make new ideas, we give those people credit. If you do not give people credit, that's plagiarism. The quickest way to get an F and to be seen as an illegitimate scholar or a person is to take someone else's idea and not give them credit. Giving people credit where credit is due is a sign of maturity and a sign that you are becoming a scholar. Okay? So I've given you information about plagiarism. Do not do it. Do not copy and paste stuff off of Wikipedia and try to put it in your paper. I'll find out. I know more about this subject than you do. Now, a good source for writing is the Chicago Manual of Style, and it's probably in its 14th edition now, or Kate Turabian's Manual for Writers. You should have, as a minimum, as a college student, what we call Turabian's Thesis Guide. Kate Turabian's Manual for Writers and Term Papers. You can get that in paperback, cost you $10. You should have that all throughout your college career. The Chicago Manual of Style, I have that, and I've memorized good portions of it, so I don't need to refer to it. All papers, as you know, must be about 14-point font, must be in MS Word. The whole world has gone to MS Word. If you use other things like WordPerfect, not happening. I've given you some examples of citation. I've given you the Jack Horner, that's a standard citation. I've given you stuff for articles and parenthetical. The way you must follow my examples to the letter on citations. If you don't follow to the letter, I'm just going to downgrade your paper, and the worse that it gets, I'm just going to get rid of it. You know what the length of the papers are. If you've read How to Write a Historical Essay, it's got all that in there. If you haven't read that and you boloed those questions, then you're in trouble. But you need to go back and read that. But this is essentially what I've given you in 35 minutes and not 20 minutes is essentially the basics of writing. So you'll have a thesis, body of evidence, and conclusion. Okay, that thesis is all important, and the body of evidence, you're going to get that from scholarly books and from articles on JSTOR. Now, let me just say a word about JSTOR real quickly. It just popped into my head. You can access JSTOR from the LA City College Library website. It's free as long as you're an LA City College student. Now, on JSTOR, when you get into it, it's going to have the search bar. What you're going to do is just type in your topic in that search bar and click it, and you'll get masses of numbers of paper that will be tied in some way to your paper. You'll just have to sort through those, look at the ones that you want, and use those. A couple of quick things to make your writing go faster. Don't try to prove things that are absurd. Don't try to prove that Hernan Cortez was the greatest human being ever. How can you do that? You can't prove that someone was the greatest human being ever. Did you interview and go ask every human being? Don't use common colloquial language like, that dude was a badass, or the conquistadors really messed those dudes up. That's called a colloquial language, back on the block language. We're in college, so in college you use basic writing, which means not using that kind of language. And trust me, students do it all the time. I will downgrade you for using colloquial language. You're not quite sure what colloquial language is? Look it up. It's easier. Don't try to prove anything too difficult. Stick with something that's relatively easy. The best thing to do is to write somewhat simple theses. Keep it simple. What I used to tell my soldiers in the Army, KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. The more complicated it gets, the more time you waste. So try not to go out so much on a limb with your papers. Try to stick within the normal ranges. So for example, if you want to write something really exotic, that's going to take you too long. Okay? Now, I'm going to sign off here because we're approaching 40 minutes, 20 minutes over. But if you have any questions about writing the paper at any more length, just send me a note on Etudes.